Leaders from the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN, are meeting in Laos on Wednesday with a new peace plan for Myanmar on the agenda. The country is in the grip of a civil war after the military junta seized control in a coup in 2021. One of the groups fighting the regime is the Arakan army in Myanmar's Rakhine state. Rohingya refugees who fled the region say they're being forcibly recruited into the war. One of the so-called recruiting grounds is Cox's Bazar refugee camp in Bangladesh, from where DW's Arafatul Islam reports. We're protecting the identities of those who've spoken to us.
This is Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh. It's the world's biggest refugee camp, housing more than 1 million Rohingya refugees. There is not much here, but they are supposed to be safe from persecution and violent conflict at home in Myanmar. And yet, people here fear kidnapping and forced recruitment to fight in the civil war. We meet a 23-year-old who we will call Muhammad. He tells us he was leaving an English language lesson a few months ago when he was grabbed off the street.
I was returning from my private tutor in the evening when 10 to 15 armed masked men abducted me and sent me to Myanmar. I was kept there for 3 months. Then they gave me a battle rifle to fight in the civil war. Myanmar army soldiers used to put us in front, and they stayed behind us.
He says he was forced to fight in Rakhine state, where hostilities between government forces and rebels, the Arakan army, have intensified recently. Muhammad managed to escape and return to the camp. But he now lives in fear of the kidnappers finding him again.
Those who abducted me earlier are not letting me stay in my camp. They have been looking for me in my home for the last 3 days to send me back to Myanmar.
Human rights activists say Rohingyas don't trust either side of the conflict.
Myanmar's military has been in control of the country since 1962. We didn't get peace under their administration. They don't keep their word. The Arakan army hasn't been in control. They were formed in 2009 and have yet to rule. We'll only see how much they would do for the Rohingya if they rule the region.
Some Rohingya refugees of this camp in Cox's Bazar alleged that both sides have used Rohingya separatist groups in Bangladesh to forcibly recruit hundreds of young Rohingya men and boys to fight for them. However, both the Myanmar military and the Arakan army denied these allegations. Another Rohingya refugee, who we'll call Abdul, says he was promised Myanmar citizenship if he went and fought.
They said we'd be offered Rakhine, but we'd have to fight for the land. We were there with the Myanmar military. But at some point I noticed others who went there were quietly starting to leave. We didn't like it. I saw suffering and felt bad, so I left too.
The International Crisis Group estimates at least 2,000 refugees were recruited from Cox's Bazar this year to fight in the conflict in Rakhine state. The head of the RRRC, Bangladesh government's refugee organization, says he is doing what he can to stop such forced recruitment from Cox's Bazar.
The Myanmar military or the Arakan army recruiting from the camp is new information to me. I haven't heard of such a thing before. However, we heard that there had been a process of forced recruitment in the camp a few months ago. A Rohingya group was accused of such activities. We have asked our law enforcement agencies to stop forced recruitment.
This doesn't make Muhammad feel much safer.
I just want to study. I will be safe if I can continue studying.
But doing that while in hiding and worrying he will be kidnapped again seems like a tall order. For a young man like him, Cox's Bazar is a refuge that is not safe enough.
Our Asia Pacific Bureau Chief Georg Matthes spoke with Lina Alexandra from the Centre for Strategic and International Studies in Jakarta. They talked about what promise these talks hold for ending Myanmar's civil war.
The Association of Southeast Asian Nations is meeting for their annual summit in Laos. Top of the agenda is the civil war that is raging in neighboring Myanmar. To discuss this topic, I'm joined by Lina Alexandra. She's a researcher at the CSIS think tank in Jakarta. Lina, tell me, it's been 3 years since the military coup. What's the situation in Myanmar?
I think the situation is certainly getting much more, complex and dangerous, to be frank, And for us, I think it's the situation that we really don't want to see. I think the country is really plunging into a kind of a civil war. Although you might not really see it in the capital, but I think in the outskirts, in the outside Yangon and in Naypyidaw, I think there's a lot of conflict clashes on the ground. And that's really, really concerning, I think, for countries in the region.
ASEAN has tried to facilitate, has tried to put pressure on the military junta that is ruling the country. How successful has this been? There's been a 5 consensus plan. Has that completely failed?
Well, I think it's a mixed result, to be frank. I think ASEAN has attempted to put some efforts, to mitigate the situation, trying to find a solution to the crisis. But of course, it's not an easy one. I think the crisis that we are facing currently in Myanmar is a totally different crisis that we used to have before with Myanmar, with the military regime controlling the country. But now I think it's really kind of the whole nation-building process, I must say, where now the conflict not only involves the pro-democratic groups, but also the ethnic resistance groups that are fighting also against the military. So with the 5-point consensus, your question is whether it is a failure or not. Well, I think, yes, a lot of points, that the points in the 5-point consensus are still not yet been implemented, I must say. For example, the cessation of violence is not really taking place on the ground, obviously. The delivery of humanitarian assistance in massive scale that reach to the whole country is not happening as well, despite some of the limited humanitarian assistance taking place at the border areas mostly, and let alone the political dialogue process is not happening at all.
Should ASEAN put more pressure to boost this 5-point plan?
Well, I think definitely that should be the case, but that's the ideal situation. ASEAN, I think now, as the time is ticking, ASEAN has been quite limited. Why is it like that? It's basically because ASEAN is not united enough in its effort. Some countries, I think there are gaps in terms of how ASEAN member states look at the crisis. Some actually look at this is a regional crisis that ASEAN needs to work together to solve the crisis, to facilitate solution to the crisis. But some other countries still insist that this is the domestic issues.
Which countries would that be?
It's basically some of we call it as the CLF countries, like Cambodia, Laos to some extent, and Vietnam, I think largely still see that this is actually, the domestic problems of Myanmar. While Indonesia, Singapore, and Thailand to some extent look at this as the regional crisis, although the approach might be quite vary from these countries.
Laos and Cambodia, for instance, but also Vietnam are close to China. Now ASEAN is also having a China summit. Is there any chance for moving things?
Well, I'm not too sure whether the Myanmar case is being brought up, by ASEAN as a whole. But I think in different occasions, I believe, especially from the Indonesian side, I think we tried to send the message, definitely, for China to use some of the leverage to control the situation, especially after the operation, we call it Operation 1027, where China actually launched military operation to, to curb some of the illegal criminal activities across the border that threatened Chinese citizens and Chinese business activities there. So in that sense, from that operation, we know that China actually has some leverage to put pressure, but I think China certainly doesn't want the situation to be internationalized to some extent. So that's why they just do limited, operation to control, to secure the border for their own specific interests.
What would you say could ASEAN do now to improve things?
I think the first thing for ASEAN is really to seriously look this crisis as a regional problem. That they need to handle it, they need to deal with it in order to, revamp or gain again, ASEAN's credibility. So to have that common mindset, that's the most important thing. Secondly, to work on the crisis, not only for the short term. Why I'm saying this, because the ASEAN approach so far is, just put we call it as the hot potato on the lap of each chairmanship. So each ASEAN chairmanship only deals with the issue within 1 year term of the chairmanship. There is no sustainability, I must say. There is no continuity from one chair to the other on how ASEAN should deal with this. So each ASEAN chair actually just saying, okay, now the hot potato is like coming to my lap and deal with that only within 1 year term, and after that ready, to pass the hot potato to the next chair. And that doesn't work.
ASEAN has often been criticized as a talking shop. When it comes to Myanmar, is it?
Well, I think in this case, I must say ASEAN has put some efforts. As you see, the 5-point consensus, despite of a lot of criticisms against it, ASEAN has shown that it has, been able to actually gather together and then discuss over the issue, discuss about what ASEAN should do on this particular crisis. So in that sense, and I think that's quite a rare thing for ASEAN to be able to organize the special leaders meeting that came out with the 5-point consensus. So in that sense, that indicates that ASEAN actually can do something if the leaders really want to do it. And of course, the big questions: will ASEAN continue with this effort? Will ASEAN seriously put forward the so-called implementation plan of the 5-point consensus to actually push for the agenda that ASEAN wants with this Myanmar crisis?
Would it be a good idea to maybe invite the generals to talk more? Because excluding them hasn't had much of an impact.
Well, I think it depends. What do you mean by, well, I think there has been a lot of debate about engaging with the generals. I think it really depends on how we define the meetings, the engagement with the generals. I think that should not be symbolizes or indicates that we recognize the military junta ruling in the country, because that's not something that the people of Myanmar wants to. Talking with the generals, that's something that has to be done because they are part of the parties they are now, or actors they are now having conflict in the country. If ASEAN steps up to facilitate the so-called political dialogue, the conversation has to be done with all stakeholders. And the military actually is part of the stakeholders to some extent. So in that sense, the meeting is to convey what ASEAN wants to do with the Myanmar crisis. As much as ASEAN will have to talk also with the NUG, ASEAN has to talk with different, ethnic groups, representatives, things like that, to help them to craft the so-called political solution to the country. And that's something that has to be done.
When you say it's a regional conflict, would you say the fact that this civil war has been going on for 3 years now is a signal that ASEAN members simply don't care enough about Myanmar?
I don't think that's the case. I think ASEAN, at least some of the ASEAN countries, they really do care about the situation. But the crisis itself is a very complex one. It's totally different crisis that we are facing with Myanmar currently. In the past, it's really about pushing for democracy, things like that. But now it's different. Now it involves the whole country with the ethnic groups, which is actually the minority groups that previously was really under the ground, basically. That's not really being come up in the picture. To be frank with ASEAN, when they initially step up to actually facilitate trying to facilitate solution to the crisis, they have very little knowledge about these ethnic groups, about what they are doing, and so on and so forth. So now we call it as like the Pandora box has been opened. It's a total mess that we are seeing now, and then that's definitely something that cannot be done only just 1 or 2 years.
What's your prediction for the conflict, or maybe what could be a momentum that could be a game changer?
I think there has been quite high expectations for toward the Malaysian Chairmanship next year in 2025, because that's also the time when ASEAN has to launch its post-2025 community vision for ASEAN. So I think, and Malaysia has a strong agenda to really push for a breakthrough in this Myanmar crisis as well. So that might be the momentum. And also, I think Indonesia, since it's finished with its chairmanship in 2023, Indonesia proposed the idea of the so-called ASEAN Troika, where we want the past chair, the present chair, and the future chairs actually to have consultation together on how they can push a breakthrough in Myanmar. So that creates some sort of sustainability on how ASEAN should approach the crisis. But that needs champion. So for me personally, I hope my government, my future government, my next government will also focus on this issue to really bring ASEAN to work together and then deal with the crisis.
Lina Alexandra, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.